The Last Contender by Cody Ouellette. The location, Solaris VII. The bar, Silesia, Solaris City. October 14th, 3053. Wisps of smoke rose in thin contrails from the battered remains of several poorly extinguished cigarettes slowly burning themselves to nothing in the countertop ashtray. The bar was old and stained by beer or other less savory things where the varnish had been worn away by the hands and elbows of countless patrons. It wasn't made of any local wood, and if pressed, a regular might reveal in hushed whispers that the bar was smuggled here in pieces from Terra by one of the first colonists. The bar, known only as the bar, was the oldest on Solaris. It had survived at least 3 fires and the fury of the succession wars in the relative safety of a quiet basement not too far from downtown Silesia. The bar had no sign, nor were there markings on the door. The outside was dingy and stained by the planet's frequent rains, its insides forested with the rising plumes of cigarettes and decorated with mementos of pilots long dead and forgotten. It was a place trafficked by a few dozen regulars, Solaris natives of long standing. Patronage of the bar was nearly a hereditary right, and new patrons were such a rarity that they garnered only distrust and intense security. Accidental patrons were rarer still, and seldom returned for a second visit. For a regular, bringing someone who wasn't a Solaris native to the bar was a crime approaching sacrilege. It was no Valhalla, but for Duncan Fisher it was the next best thing. In spite of its antisocial demeanor, the bar was a good place to go get a drink, catch a show on Hollow, and avoid the howling masses that plagued Valhalla's entrances, eager for a glimpse of a celebrity, noble, or champion. Well, Duncan was no noble, and with his medium-weight champion days nearly a decade behind him, he was hardly a celebrity. But that hardly mattered to the Solaris true believers, the fight fans for which arena attendance was as much a religious experience as a Lost Tech HPG instruction manual would have been to a Comstar adept. An ex-champion was still a champion, and everyone had their favorites. Duncan still counted himself fortunate that his fans were relatively tame. Unfortunately, they were also numerous. Unlike most ex-champions, Duncan was still an active competitor in the arenas. Knowing he'd only beat an opponent if he were smarter, more adaptable, quicker, or had simply chosen the better tactic from the outset, and never knowing which he'd need from moment to moment, gave him a thrill like nothing else in the inner sphere. And although he rarely admitted it to himself, Duncan loved the arenas as much as his fans did. Some days, he just wanted a quiet place to catch the latest match. For Duncan, that place was the bar. His eyes shifted from his dark ale and settled on the bar's central holotank, just as the commercials faded into a slow pan across a wildly cheering crowd. He knew the network's timing by heart. They'd always allot themselves precisely 9 minutes of commercials before a single fighter was allowed into the ring. Then another 4 before they introduced the second. The network knew most people were willing to accept nearly 15 minutes of commercials in a 20-minute span, provided they got a money shot of a battlemech and some decent color commentary for a few minutes in between. Today's commercials had run egregiously long, however, and the challenger's mech had been introduced in complete silence. Yenlo Wang had returned to Solaris VII, announced only by nearly 4 minutes of the crowd screaming themselves hoarse, set to a rather ominous drumbeat, followed, of course, by another interminably long stretch of commercials. The network was milking the return of what was certainly the most famous Centurion, if not the most famous mech, ever to set foot on Solaris. The network would squeeze Yenlo Wang's reappearance for every penny it could. Duncan could hardly blame them. He just found the delay irritating. The current pan ended as a little cicada strode into Steiner Stadium. The little mech was painted orange on top with a white underbelly, and bore both the classic tiger stripes and a snarling, fang-filled set of shark-like jaws just below its cockpit. It also sported a stylishly useless fin on the back, styled to look like an oversized heat radiator. The fin was useless, of course. Just a chunk, most likely carved from a block of easily replaceable ballistics plastic or some pieces of armor taken from an agromech. Designed to be tough enough to withstand regular maintenance, but also designed to simply break away if it ever took a hit in combat. The crowd's wild cheers were almost immediately replaced with jeers, and the shot quickly jumped to a shot of a thrown beer bottle shattering against the meter-thick transplex sheets that helped protect the spectators from stray fire. The cicada was not a fan favorite. Even the best of them tended to be lightly armed and too reliant on hit-and-run attacks launched from dense cover. In the wide-open Steiner Stadium, the cicada appeared to be at a huge disadvantage. As if on cue, Cal Yeager's image entered the frame.
Good evening, fight fans. It's shaping up to be an interesting match here in the Coliseum tonight. It's shaping up to be a medium-weight throwdown, with the Sky Tigers' Morgan Budge taking on a complete newcomer. Morgan's here at the Steiner Arena tonight, not in his typical Griffin, but in a tiny undergun cicada. It's enough to make a man wonder if maybe the Sky Tigers are throwing their newest competitor a bone.
"You're full of shit, Cal," Duncan mumbled into his beer. "That cicada's the only chance the Sky Tigers have, and if you had any sense, you'd already know that."
"What you say, Duncan?"
the bartender, Maurice Finnegan, asked.
"Cal's buggering it again?"
A dozen nearby faces turned in Duncan's direction, but this, too, was typical of the bar. As the local arena expert, he tended to provide his own commentary during fights, and whenever he was around, Maurice tended to turn down the set so the regulars could listen. The regulars always seemed to enjoy it, but Duncan thought that was probably because they'd always choose a Solaris native over a Merrick-born actor like Cal. "Look closely at that cicada, Maury." Duncan waved his hand at the holotank. "That's the Sky Tiger's new tiger shark, and that idiotic fin's not the only change. I know what you're thinking. A big PPC barrel in the chest means a CDA-3C, right? But look closer. No machine guns at the knees. And when have you ever seen a cicada with jump jets? That's not an old -3C. That's a brand new CDA-3F. Of course, Cal won't tell you that, because he doesn't know a damn thing about battlemechs." Duncan smiled. "The Tiger Shark is a factory refit mounting recovered Lost-Tech equipment, which means it's faster, it's tougher, runs cooler than any cicada you've ever seen, and it's armed with Star League tech. On top of all that, it also jumps at least 280 meters. Morgan's the best man to pilot it, because it'll move and fight a lot like a faster version of his Griffin. Sure, the Griffin's tougher, but you've heard the same stories I have. Yenlo Wang's got so much state-of-the-art hardware that it's practically a national secret. It would tear an old-school Griffin apart in half a minute." "So, you think Morgan can win?" Duncan laughed. "Ha! If the Tiger Shark's auto-eject were to malfunction and punch Morgan out right now, it'd save us a lot of time. Before the break, I got a good look at Yenlo Wang. Kai moves it the same way his father always did. The kid's good. Of course," he waved his hand at the hollow again, "Cal can't say that. The bookies don't make any money unless someone takes the stupid long odds bets for Morgan. He has to play it cool, play down Kai's skills and history, and say something like, 'Sure, Kai Allard Liao may be a war hero, but Solaris VII isn't much like the battlefields he's used to. He's an inexperienced newcomer, while Morgan has 7 wins under his belt and is a strong contender to take on Jason Block next year. The fight may seem one-sided, but Morgan's probably got some tricks that a new fighter won't be able to predict.'" Maury extended his arm, turning up the holotank's volume with his handheld remote.
7 wins to his credit," Cal was saying, "while Kai Allard Liao is a newcomer. He doesn't know the ins and outs of the arena, and Morgan's sure to surprise him. Kai may be a decorated war hero, But when you count the Archon Prince among your circle of friends, what's a medal every now and then, right?
"That's a low blow, Cal," Duncan exclaimed while his listeners applauded his prediction. "I didn't think you'd criticize a veteran. That's going to kill you in the ratings tonight."
"He's going to cost us a goddamn fortune,"
a gruff voice cut through the bar's formerly mirthful atmosphere. Duncan turned as a thick-set man rose slowly from his corner table. His wooden chair shrieked as protest as it scraped along the hardwood floor. The man's deep-set eyes were almost lost beneath his beetled brow, but the set of his jaw told Duncan the whole story.
"We'll have to censor the whole thing for the FedCom rebroadcast."
"At least the Capellans will eat it up," Maury interjected helpfully. "Duncan, Jack. Jack, Duncan." Duncan nodded. "Mr. No last names in the bar," Maurice cautioned. Jack took a slow puff of his cheroot cigar, rolling it between his teeth as he stared at Cal's image. He gave Duncan's shoulder a meaty squeeze.
"You tired of being shot at, Duncan? I'd like you back on the network, full time. This is Cal's last season. I'm not going to lose our monopoly because that Merrick bastard felt like taking a jab at the Archon Prince."
"I've only ever done guest spots," Duncan protested, poleaxed by the offer. The network could be generous, he knew. Very generous if they wanted. Duncan could only shake his head. "I've got a good chance of taking the championship this year. I can't give that up, no matter how tempting your offer is." They both turned as a ragged cheer drew their attention back to the holotank. Morgan's tiger shark took a sharp backwards leap, trying to keep Yenlo Wang at bay, but it wasn't enough. While the Centurion was normally slow, this was no ordinary Centurion. It was faster on the ground than the Cicada was in the air. As it came down, Kai Allard Liao fired a shot from his Gauss rifle that shattered most of the armor protecting the lighter mech's left leg. With an almost contemptuous ease, the medium-pulse lasers in Yenlo Wang's left arm sawed through newly exposed myomer and foamed steel bones in an instant. The Cicada took one final backward step before its leg sheared off at the thigh, and the little medium flopped onto its side like a land-bound fish.
"Sure you do,"
Jack grunted.
"Maury, call me a cab, would you? I've got business."
Duncan felt himself smile, his fingers tensing with momentary excitement. Despite Jack's doubts, Duncan found himself wanting to face this Kai Allard Liao in the arena. Win or lose, it'd be a hell of a fight. Jack turned away, stepping towards the door, but froze and turned to regard Duncan with his beady, porcine eyes. Duncan suppressed a shudder. Eyes like those didn't see human beings. They only saw a man-sized collection of numbers that tabulated into big profits.
"Oh, and one last thing,"
the heavy-set suit added.
"Duncan's drinks are on my tab tonight. Think about my offer, Duncan. It's a rough world out there. If you change your mind, let Maury know. It's an open offer. For now."
Location: Solaris VII, Boreal Reach Arena, Mech Bay 37, October 27th, 3053. The Wolverine came straight at Duncan in a headlong rush. The medium-pulse laser in the turret, mounted in front of the mech's wedge-shaped head, stitched a flickering beam across the Griffin's chest, melting an angry scar in the machine's heavily armored carapace. The damage diagnostics didn't so much as flicker, but Duncan didn't need them. He knew what that laser was capable of, and it didn't worry him. The Wolverine's right arm rose threateningly as the 14-centimeter barrel of the weapon mounted there swung in line with Duncan's chest. He darted to the right on jets of pearlescent fire, taking his headstrong opponent by surprise. As his Griffin's wedge-shaped feet hit the hard-packed earth, he let loose a flight of SRMs directly into the Wolverine's thinly armored back. The roar of a Shadowhawk shoulder-mounted autocannon snapped Duncan out of his daydream. His Griffin didn't mount an autocannon, so of course the scene played out differently than the one in his head. For a few moments, Duncan had allowed his mind to wander, and had put himself in the shoes of Peter Dexter, the pilot whose recording he was now watching. Peter had always been one of Duncan's favorite opponents. The man was a solid pilot, but he tended to habitualize combat in a way that made him easy to predict and easier still to misdirect. The heavy shell from Dexter's autocannon glanced from the charging Wolverine's frontal armor, shattering the outermost layer of steel ceramic composites, but not penetrating deeply. Duncan shook his head in dismay as his stand-in engaged the Wolverine head-on. The fight hadn't been one of Peter Dexter's best. Right from the outset, Peter had scored a hit on the young Riccardo Vecchi's right arm and been lured into a false sense of superiority, as Vecchi allowed the limb to hang limp, as though a glancing blow at long range had been enough to knock his primary weapon out of commission. Peter scored several unanswered hits as the younger pilot advanced, and had grown so cocky by the time Riccardo closed that he'd made no move to avoid the Wolverine's headlong rush. It was a ruse, of course, and Duncan had spotted it immediately. The ammo feed built into the Wolverine's right arm was similar to the one that had fed the Wolverine's original autocannon, but Riccardo's machine was hardly stock. Peter Dexter froze for an instant as the Wolverine's arm swung in line with his machine's left breast. The glow from the Gauss rifle's charging coils were as unmistakable as they were threatening. A silvery streak intersected the Shadowhawk's chest, and Duncan's cockpit view spun as Peter's gyros tumbled. Duncan would have cringed at the hit if he hadn't felt that Peter had deserved it. Was it really so hard to review an opponent's past matches for surprises? Even a relative newcomer like Riccardo had a few matches under his belt, and this hadn't been the only fight the Gauss rifle had swung in his favor. Duncan killed the recording and leaned back in his Griffin's command couch. He didn't need to see the fight finished. This hadn't been his first viewing. But with less than an hour before he took the field, it was good to have a quick reminder of what he was about to face. Not that Duncan was worried. Mechwarriors like Riccardo Vecchi were common enough on Solaris, and Riccardo's tells were obvious enough. Young, rich, aggressive, and a certain arrogance that suggested he was noble-born. Duncan thought the man was most likely a third or fourth son, or perhaps just a first cousin, from a big family with far too many of both. Riccardo had either been disowned or, when the eldest brother inherited, had his formerly easy life crumble around him. So he'd taken his inheritance, or perhaps just stolen a family heirloom, and come to Solaris seeking a safe life of alcohol, arena fights, and whatever other debauchery he could get himself into, instead of simply going into politics or his nation's military. Then again, in Vecchi's native Free Worlds League, perhaps Solaris really had been safer than taking up the pen or the sword. Duncan almost laughed at that. Normally Solaris was about as safe as pointing a hover limo at a demolisher tank and holding the accelerator down with a brick. The end result was usually the same. The thought that he might be wrong about his vision of Vecchi's history never crossed Duncan's mind. He'd been at this game a long time, and if there was one thing Solaris had taught him, it was how to read people. Riccardo Vecchi was scum. A sharp rap from a wrench rang twice on the cockpit hatch, shaking Duncan from his thoughts and bringing a warm smile to his lips. It was his chief tech, Rhea. 2 strikes was the half-hour warning. Everything had checked out all right, so it was time to open the hatch, do a few stretches, and share a pre-battle glass of scotch. For luck, of course. Duncan stood and moved to undog the hatch, but winced as a third clang echoed from its surface. 3 strikes meant strangers in the mech bay. This close to launch, it could only be the fight organizers with a last-minute change in the itinerary. That usually meant bad news. Either the fight had been pushed back due to a technical issue, or his opponent had forfeited. Well, Duncan wouldn't turn down a free win, even though the payout for a forfeit was pathetic. He was a popular fighter. It wouldn't be hard to arrange another match in a few days if his machine didn't need the usual post-match repairs. Duncan threw on the oversized bomber jacket he kept in the Griffin's cockpit for occasions such as this, and crawled onto the machine's left shoulder. The maneuver would have been impossible on the right. The massive missile rack mounted there was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze into. It wasn't wide enough to allow the Griffin's right hatch to actually open. Duncan had always found that design oversight amusing. The Star League had felt providing pilots with multiple escape routes important, but hadn't cared enough to make sure all those exits were truly functional. He dusted himself off and gave his chief technician a winning smile. She rolled her eyes the way she always did, and Duncan couldn't help but laugh. In a lot of ways, she reminded him of his ex. Not physically. She was stockier, more muscular, and his ex-wife had had far more compelling curves. But neither of them were willing to put up with his bullshit for long. Duncan had always enjoyed the conflict, the arguments, the contest of wills, but after a time his ex-wife hadn't. It's why she had left him. He bore her no ill will for that. "Looks like Don Sava and a couple of leg breakers to see you," she said in wary tones. Rhea didn't regard Duncan, but instead stared across the small mech bay at a contingent of suited men confidently crossing the empty central space. Lycus Sava was a fight promoter Duncan had worked with in the past. Although his name meant wolf, Duncan felt the man more resembled a sewer rat dressed up in a three-piece suit. He was an advertiser, and rumored mafioso from the Free Worlds League. Duncan wasn't sure if the rumors were true. Sava billed himself as an advertiser, and Duncan had to admit he was good at selling Free Worlders tickets to upcoming matches, whether their nationals were involved or not. In his younger days, Duncan had paid for Sava's advice a time or two for interview strategies in order to help him bring in as many foreign viewers as he could. That didn't mean Duncan liked the man, but he was useful on occasion, even if this visit was a complete surprise. Duncan frowned, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against the griffin's hatch. He hadn't known Sava was involved in this match, although it didn't surprise him too much. Ricardo Vecchi's meteoric rise to relevance smacked of Lycus Sava's handiwork. The man was skilled at his craft, and that craft was making young up-and-comers noteworthy enough to take Solaris by storm.
"Duncan!"
Sava's shout echoed in the cavernous mech bay.
"Come down! We have business to discuss."
"No dice, Sava!" Duncan shouted in reply. Lycus Sava wasn't here as a friend. Duncan knew that much. He released his grip on the griffin's hatch to tap his bare left wrist, as if emphasizing the watch he wasn't wearing. "There's no time. The match is in 25. We'll talk after." Duncan turned, ducking as if to re-enter the griffin.
"I took the liberty,"
Sava drawled,
"of reporting your technical issues to the organizers."
"He did what?"
Rhea hissed through clenched teeth. All activity in the mech bay ceased, as a dozen pair of eyes turned to regard the slender, dark-eyed visitor and his bulky entourage. A delay of more than 30 minutes was enough to blacklist an entire crew of technicians, and after an hour Duncan would automatically forfeit the match. Rhea's people would never be allowed to do matchwork again. Duncan and Rhea took a half-step forward in glowering unison.
"You don't move until we've had our chat."
"Handle this guy quick, Fisher," Rhea breathed, "or so help me."
Duncan didn't let her finish. Instead, leaping bodily into the scissor lift Rhea had ridden up to the griffin's shoulder. He set it descending before she could join him, drawing a venomous glare in the process. It couldn't be helped. Duncan would rather leave her stranded and shouting profanities from the griffin's shoulder than give her the opportunity to punch Lycus Sava in the face. At least the climb down would wind her enough to give Duncan a few moments to disarm the situation first. He took a deep breath and met Lycus with a warm smile, a firm handshake, and eyes hard enough to cut glass. "What can I do for you?" Duncan asked with every appearance of cordial sincerity.
"Neither of us have time for nonsense, and I know you have no interest in league politics, so I'll be brief."
Duncan found that declaration doubtful, but said nothing as Sava continued.
"Count Vecchi has, we'll say, dropped in unexpectedly to watch his youngest brother tonight, so you're going to throw the match."
Duncan's apparently friendly smile faded in an instant, his square jaw set defiantly as his lips curled into a pronounced scowl. The warmth suffusing his expression fled in an instant, and Sava's eyes widened almost imperceptibly at the sudden change in demeanor. "No," Duncan replied, "I'm not." You don't have to deal with the ramifications of this," Duncan growled, interrupting what he expected would have been a little friendly cajoling from the promoter. Lycus had to go cross-eyed to focus on the tip of an accusatory finger thrust in his face. Duncan was never one to hesitate when he could seize the initiative, never one for silence when he could speak out.
I do. I don't throw fights. The moment I bend even a little bit, even for what I'm sure you consider as a good cause, I'm done. Kaput. Finished as a fighter.
Duncan's hand withdrew as one of Sava's bodyguards shifted menacingly. He held his arms outward, palms exposed in a conciliatory manner.
You know how the game world works, Lycus. The only reason I get straight fights is because the bookies and the mobsters and the wannabe street toughs know that I don't bend. Not for you, not for a visiting noble from the Free Worlds League. And if the Archon Prince himself was to walk through those doors, I'd tell him the same thing I'm telling you now. Get the hell out, and don't ever ask me to throw a fight again.
Duncan spun on his heels, the conversation finished as far as he was concerned. Lycus apparently had other ideas and mumbled something in Greek. A hand only slightly smaller than an atlas closed on Duncan's left shoulder and spun him around. Duncan's hand came up, the familiar weight of the holdout pistol he kept secreted in his jacket sleeve in his hand. It was a ubiquitous variation on an ancient design. 2 barrels with 2 bullets in the chamber, and no more. Such pistols were common on Solaris. They were small, light, and even though their accuracy suffered at ranges greater than 4 to 5 meters, they were cheap and easy to conceal.
What are you playing at, Fisher?
Lycus trailed off as a double-barreled pistol swung in line with the bridge of his nose. 2 shots weren't enough to deal with 3 men, but it was more than enough for one.
I'm not playing, Lycus,
Duncan said calmly. The man's slab-like bodyguards glowered, and one took a step forward only to be balked by a technician with a Gunther MP-20. Lycus swallowed visibly. A dozen pair of eyes were watching the exchange, and nearly every one of them were armed. Lycus had no way of knowing that Duncan always paid his techs a percentage after every match he won, and Duncan could see the wheels turning. Will offering the work crew a bribe work, or will it just piss them all off? It was time to up the stakes. Duncan pointed at the Griffin with his left thumb.
This may be the game world, but I never play around. We were testing the audio feeds when you came in, which means I've got a recording of you telling me to throw the match. If you don't want me playing it in the post-match interview, I highly suggest you cut your losses and get out now. This isn't going to hurt my career, but it could very well kill yours.
The Griffin was doing no such thing, of course, but Duncan hadn't lied about the recording. He really did love his oversized bomber jacket. It made it so easy to hide all sorts of interesting things. As Lycus stammered, Duncan gave a conciliatory shrug and lied through $1 million smile.
I like you too much to do that to you, so please don't force my hand. I have a match to win.
Less than a minute later, Duncan stepped back onto the shoulder of his Griffin and handed Rhea the control box for the scissor lift. She stared at him incredulously. Duncan offered only a shrug in reply and said,
It looks like we're not going to have time for that good luck drink.
Location Solaris VII, Boreal Reach Arena, October 27th, 3053. The Boreal Reach was the most expensive, technologically advanced, and also, paradoxically, the least popular arena on Solaris VII. The Boreal Reach began its life as an SLDF training facility. An ingenious Lost Tech relic imposed a holographic battlefield over 25 square kilometers of carefully landscaped Earth. The Reach could simulate any environment, from sandy deserts to rocky badlands, to Arctic wastes, to dense jungles that put the Capellan Arena in Cathay to shame. The holograms in the Boreal Reach were nearly flawless. That was the problem. Innumerable rumors plagued the arena, and Duncan was aware of most of them. He had heard that the owners use holograms to cover up critically damaged mechs and promote last-minute betting, and that the fights in the Reach were just advanced combat simulations with no real weapons fire taking place and holographic damage. Some people even claimed that the fights were entirely computer-generated, using footage spliced in from other battles to keep things authentic. Having fought in the Boreal Reach more than once, Duncan was fairly certain that only the first rumor was true. A hologram could paint damage onto the surface of a mech easily enough, but most of the time it just looked wrong to experienced eyes. Likewise, the impact of autocannon rounds and the molten spray of vaporized armor from a good laser hit were both difficult things for a computer to simulate on the fly. Duncan had experienced live mech simulations, and while the experience was always more realistic than that offered by a simulator or home computer, they were still very little like the real thing. A mech twitching its myomer muscles to simulate a hit from a Gauss rifle was a far cry from an actual hit with a Gauss rifle. There was a nauseating violence about the real thing that a computer just couldn't duplicate. As far as Duncan was concerned, the biggest problem with the Boreal Reach were the holes in the map. The holographic battlefield may have been indistinguishable from the real thing, but it didn't stop incoming fire. The Star League had thought of that, and the holograms closely matched the real terrain. Of course, over the centuries, weapons fire and simple erosion had taken their toll on the underlying terrain. And while the system's original designers had thought of that as well, reprogramming the computer was far more expensive than simply hiring construction crews to pile on more dirt. In more than one place, the underpinning hills could be seen poking through the holographic earth, while in others the holograms covered nothing at all. None of these gaps were large enough to hide a battlemech, but there were several places where weapons fire could pass unhindered. Footing, too, was uncertain, as mech feet tended to vanish beneath the holographic earth. This led to timidity among pilots uncertain of their footing, and to the rise of the Arctic environment simulation that gave the Boreal Reach its modern name. This increased uncertainty tended to lend fights in the arena a timidity not found in other venues. Duncan was an old enough hand to not let his own discomfort get the better of him. If he took an extra fraction of a second to be sure of his footing before putting his weight down, the arrogant swagger of the Griffin's angular hips didn't show it. Duncan had already crossed a dozen kilometers in a wide half-circle, sticking mostly to gullies and avoiding the sloping hilltops. Riccardo Vecchi was young, arrogant, and impatient. Duncan expected Vecchi to charge straight across the arena, and had prepared a route that should have caught the other warrior from the side. He was almost disappointed. As he crested the low ridge that marked the edge of Vecchi's expected path, the young warrior was nowhere in sight. The environment yielded no clues. Holographic snow didn't show footprints, and the only shadows visible were those painted on with bits and bytes. Even the night sky was obscured by the massive holographic aurora that gave the Boreal Reach its name. It served several real purposes. It actually didn't stretch to the horizon, but was carefully rendered to appear as though it did, which clearly delineated the boundaries of the arena. It also served to create an interesting backdrop that made for some fantastic promotional shots while simultaneously allowing mechs in a night fight to stand out to paying customers. Finally, it also served as a notice to Solaris City that there was a fight tonight and that anyone not watching it was missing out. Duncan's eyes scanned his circle vision display, his practice eyes picking out details in the highly compressed display that an inexperienced pilot might have missed. A dark shadow in the lee of a low hill shifted slightly, and Duncan slammed his feet down on the Griffin's control pedals. The 55-ton war machine leapt into the air as the plasma-powered jump jets in its back roared to life in an instant. Either Riccardo Vecchi was a tactical genius, or someone had warned him of Duncan's approach. That wasn't unheard of. Although direct communication with pilots from individuals outside the arena was supposed to be impossible, it was an open secret that the powerful jamming devices used at other arenas could wreak havoc on the Boreal Reach's hologram emitters if they were placed too close to the arena itself. Nearly invisible in the darkness, the silvery streak of a Gauss rifle round passed a scant meter below the Griffin's feet. Vecchi's Wolverine was too distant for a good shot, but Duncan fired anyway the moment he touched down. The large pulse laser in the Griffin's right arm actually fired far too quickly for the human eye to easily see, but that didn't matter. The Griffin's DI computer simply computed the beam's path and left a lingering series of lines representing each shot. It had taken extensive retooling to get the computer to even recognize the highly advanced weapon, but Duncan had spared no expense when the time came to refit his machine. His shots missed wide, to the Wolverine's right, and Vetchi slowed to a confident walk and twisted away to protect his Gauss rifle, as Duncan's intense study suggested he probably would. In spite of the obvious modifications to his mech, Vetchi moved as though he was certain Duncan would try for a long-range shooting match. Duncan smiled as he broke into a headlong charge and was gratified as Vetchi's Wolverine stiffened in surprise. By the time the Gauss rifle's capacitors recharged, Duncan intended to be well inside the heavy weapon's minimum range. Vetchi continued twisting as Duncan approached, trying to pass to the Griffin's left. Duncan was expecting this as well. All of the footage he'd watched suggested that Vetchi preferred to use his left arm and torso as a shield to protect his biggest gun, which wasn't to say the Wolverine's left side wasn't threatening in its own right. The SRM six-pack mounted in its boxy launcher was enough evidence to the contrary. Staying to Vetchi's left was the safe option. It kept the man's Gauss rifle out of position, but Vetchi was prepared for and comfortable with that tactic. He'd undoubtedly worked out many counters, so Duncan wasn't about to let Vetchi get too comfortable this time around. By the time Vetchi made his break, Duncan was already moving to intercept him. Vetchi saw his ploy far too late, and the medium-pulse laser in the turret-like mounting beneath the Wolverine's boxy head spat fire in Duncan's path as though trying to discourage his aggression. Duncan didn't flinch, even as the laser drew a fresh scar across the Griffin's broad chest. His carelessness wouldn't make Rhea's job easier, but he was willing to take a hit or two to seize the initiative. Besides, Duncan thought, as his lips split into a warm, friendly, and ultimately cool smile, he always gave back better than he took. Duncan's thumb pressed the secondary target interlock circuit with enough force to indent skin through his thick leather gloves. With a hiss and a roar, he sent a flight of 12 short-range missiles across the 60-meter gap between his machine and Vetchi's. At this range, it was nearly impossible to miss, and the Wolverine's upper chest and shoulders were wreathed in flame and shrapnel. Duncan's follow-up shot with the medium laser mounted just beneath the pistol-like large pulse laser missed wide, but that was fine. The gold dot in the center of his mech's crosshairs flashed as his large pulse laser recharged, and not even the rattle of a trio of missile hits from Vetchi's own six-pack launcher was enough to shake his aim. The pulse laser bored into the Wolverine's right torso and sent a molten stream of ceramet dripping down the mech's hip and leg. Another hit or two there, and Vetchi would be in real trouble. Vetchi clearly knew it too. The barrel of his Gauss rifle came up the instant it recharged. Vetchi was at least canny enough to keep the barrel low, so a stray laser or missile couldn't damage the weapon's charging coil. Unfortunately, that also left the weapon out of position when it finally recharged. That gave Duncan a half-second to act, which normally wouldn't have been enough to do more than offer a brief prayer or enact a pre-prepared plan. Fortunately, Duncan was prepared. When he'd originally redesigned his Griffin to take advantage of new technologies recovered in the wake of the clan invasion, Duncan had come up short. A half-ton short, to be precise. He had wanted a pair of medium lasers to back up the large pulse laser in the right arm and give him something to do with the left. The housing had already been built into the left arm before he had discovered his mistake. The added weight of a Martel medium laser had proven to be too much, and every step the Griffin took had threatened to spin the machine right off its gyros. The Griffin just hadn't been built with a left-side weapon in mind, and so Duncan had found an alternate use for the spare weight. As Vetchi's Gauss rifle swung in line, Duncan flipped a toggle on his left joystick, and in an instant the Wolverine's head and upper torso was bathed in blinding light. The array of high-powered spotlights Duncan had mounted in place of the laser was lighter and had proven more useful than he'd ever expected. A battlemech's DI computer would compensate by blacking out the light's source on Vetchi's HUD, and the actual transplex canopy had been designed with light in mind and should adapt by automatically growing more opaque. But for a fraction of a second, Vetchi was exposed to the full power of Duncan's high-powered light, and that was more than enough to dazzle a man unprepared for such brilliance. The light was the kind of trick Duncan loved. He could use it precisely once to throw an enemy off balance, and anyone who'd done a little homework would be prepared for the ploy. It was dirty, but fair, and a man like Vetchi would have no idea what he'd blundered into. while a man like Kai Allard Liao wouldn't have been fazed in the slightest. The Wolverine jerked at Vetchi's involuntary reaction, and the Griffin rang like a bell as the Gauss rifle's slug shattered the armor as the shot glanced from the Griffin's left thigh. Duncan grimaced as his damage diagnostics updated. Another clean hit might cripple the leg. He had to knock that Gauss rifle out of commission. His laser swung in line, and Duncan fired without hesitation, sending an arterial spray of molten armor rising from the barrel of the Gauss rifle. The laser's pulses sought weakness, but found none, and Duncan's spread of missiles scored only a few incidental hits as Vetchi flinched away from the attack and spun once again to protect his strongest weapon. Duncan sprang forward, certain that Vetchi would retreat to try to buy a little time and distance. At the same time, Vetchi dug in his heels and lunged forward as though he anticipated Duncan would leap away in the hit-and-run fashion apparently favored by every other Griffin pilot in the inner sphere. If Duncan had been piloting a standard Griffin, it would have probably even had been a good move. Duncan gritted his teeth in the instant before the two mechs collided and slammed his feet down on the pedals to strike the hardest blow he could. A standard neurohelmet did a pretty good job of immobilizing the jaw in a reasonably comfortable fashion, but accidents weren't uncommon, and the last thing Duncan needed was to bite off his own tongue. The Wolverine and Griffin caromed off each other with a sound that made Duncan's bones ache. Both machines stumbled, but they were even in size and power, so rather than one bearing the other to the ground, they both rebounded. Tough but brittle, the standard Ceramet armor protecting the Wolverine flaked away in ablative sheets as structural bonds holding slab-like layers in place shattered and gave way. A huge rent opened from shoulder to waist across the Wolverine's right torso as the last of the armor protection there gave way. The Griffin had fared little better, though the tough and bulky ferrofibrous armor didn't shatter the way the Wolverine's standard armor had. If Duncan's secondary monitor were accurate, the left side of the Griffin's wedge-shaped chest now sported a massive dent at least the height of a man. For a brief instant, his mind wandered, and Duncan caught himself almost smiling, as he imagined Rhea's reaction to the damage. He shook himself out of it, but paid no mind to the lapse in attention. After an impact like that, both pilots would be taking stock, and judging from the way the Wolverine was reeling, Duncan had still recovered first. His large pulse laser snapped in line with the massive hole in the Wolverine's torso and scoured a molten white-hot line across the Wolverine's belly as Vetchi twisted away a fraction of a second before Duncan squeezed the trigger. The Wolverine's return fire was half-hearted at best. The medium-pulse laser in its chest missed by a meter, and only 2 of the Wolverine's SRMs struck home. The hair on the back of Duncan's neck bristled. A salvo missing so badly at such short range could only mean that Vetchi's attention was on something else. Instinctively, Duncan twisted, and was gratified an instant later as the Wolverine's fist, hidden from Duncan's direct line of sight by the missile launcher on his right shoulder, smashed against the armored cowl protecting the Griffin's right shoulder. Vetchi's other fist came around, and Duncan brought up the Griffin's left arm to take the blow like a prize fighter. Duncan's blood ran cold. Fist to fist, only piloting skill mattered, and in all honesty, Vetchi wasn't very good. It was the obviously murderous intention of the pilot that nearly gave Duncan pause. Death wasn't uncommon on Solaris, although it was typically accidental, or the result of an inter-house feud. Killing a long-time contender was a way for an up-and-coming pilot to fast-track his career. He could see that weasel Lycus's hands in this, and was immediately grateful he'd told the free worlder to go to hell. If Duncan had come out fighting to lose, he'd almost certainly have been killed. The next time Lycus showed up to Duncan's mech bay unannounced, Duncan intended to let the man have a short conversation with the bottom of his Griffin's foot. Or he'd threaten to at any rate. Duncan wasn't the type to kill a man intentionally, even knowing that other man was trying to kill him. He was a professional. Vetchi's intent wasn't enough to intimidate him. Duncan just felt no need to try to kill him in return. He wouldn't shed a tear if tonight was Ricardo Vetchi's last fight, but he suspected failing would be more painful to an apparently ambitious man like Vetchi. Well, failure in the dozen SRMs that exploded against the Wolverine's battered armor when Duncan next squeezed the trigger. The Wolverine reeled, and the inky greenish-tinted smoke that practically oozed from its battered torso spoke of either a damaged heatsink or the loss of some critical engine shielding. Shrapnel pinged from Duncan's armor like rain on a glass roof. The Wolverine's left fist came about in a vicious hook and caught the Griffin in the hip. Its right rose, and Duncan's eyes widened. Vetchy wasn't trying for a punch. He twisted, and the Griffin's left battle fist disintegrated as he interposed it between the Wolverine's Gauss rifle and the body of his mech. Duncan thrust his left arm forward and drove one of the machine's twisted endo-steel bones down the weapon's barrel. An instant later, the Gauss rifle exploded as the Griffin pierced one of its capacitors. The Wolverine lurched backwards in a parody of human agony, its right arm hanging lifeless, its power conduit severed. Duncan drove his Griffin's fist forward and tore away the last armor plating protecting the Wolverine's fusion-powered heart. A murky shadow leapt out at him from behind the circle vision strip, and he cried out in agony as the shatterproof Transplex canopy exploded inwards. In theory, Transplex couldn't make a truly sharp edge when it broke. In Duncan's experience, being pelted with chunks of marble-sized anything was always unpleasant, even if it wasn't likely to kill you outright. He had far greater concerns, however, as one of the restraining straps holding him in the command couch snapped. Momentarily off balance, the Griffin tumbled and fell. White-hot agony flashed behind Duncan's eyes as the Griffin struck the unforgiving ground, and for a few brief seconds, the whole world went black.
Location: Solaris VII, The Bar, August 14th, 3068.
So, what happened next?
Duncan eyed the man next to him in silence for a moment, tipping back his bottle of an unlabeled strong, dark beer with a name he'd never learned. It was the last bottle he'd managed to find. The man's ruby-faceted eyes glittered in the moonlight that shone through a massive crack in the building's south wall. Outside, well, Duncan didn't want to look at the smoking ruins outside, or even at the man whose company he shared. One last drink in the bar, in exchange for the truth about his last fight. That had been the deal. Duncan debated dragging things out, but his bottle was empty, and his mood for storytelling had soured. He said slowly,
"You've seen the vids. My next SRM salvo blew away the last of his engine shielding, and Vetchy shut down rather than having the decency to blow up. He was trying his hardest to kill me. Vetchy killed Augustus Maxwell in his very next match, and I know that snake Lycus put him up to all of it. Killing a skilled, well-established pilot is the perfect way to get a newcomer noticed. I cost Lycus a small fortune, and Vetchy cost me my career."
"Ah, but what a career, while it lasted."
The other man clapped his hands slowly before he spoke again. His basso voice had an unnatural mechanical quality that carried very well. It was a commander's voice, packed with authority and more than a hint of menace. It was an authority born not from the breadth of the man's chest or the power of his will, but from a cybernetic implant replacing his original voice box. Duncan wasn't impressed. Not by the real thing, and certainly not by the word of Blake's cheap, mechanical imitation authority. He'd faced death 100 times. These machine men instilled no fear in him.
"I was this close,"
Duncan held out his hand, his fingers less than 2 centimeters apart,
"from a duel with the best pilot Solaris had ever seen. Another victory or two, and one of us would have been in position to challenge the other. And then—"
Duncan trailed off slowly, a trace of earnest wistfulness entering his tone.
"And then—"
"You think you could have beaten him?"
Duncan offered his hulking companion a mischievous grin. Even amidst the horrors he'd seen over the past few months, the core of his spirit remained undaunted.
"I have no idea, but I guarantee it would have been a hell of a fight. Instead—"
He paused, rubbing the scarred bump on his back where his neck met his shoulders.
"I spent the next 3 months in the hospital while the doctors fused my vertebrae together to let me walk without severing my own spine. They told me I'd never pilot a battlemech again. Told me a hard shock like a fall or a punch would be the end of me.
They even claimed it was a miracle I made it through the post-battle interview without accidentally killing myself.
I saw that interview.
His nameless, nearly faceless benefactor laughed.
It was brilliant. What was it you told Vetchi? If...
I'm not surprised the Free Worlds League military didn't want you, Vetchi, Duncan quoted, the memory as fresh as if he'd given the interview only the day before. If this is the best your father could teach you, it's no wonder the fox trounced him.
How did you even know that old Count Vetchi nearly got himself killed back in the Fourth Succession War?
The man asked as he roared with laughter. It wasn't his physical presence, but his mirth, his sheer delight at the cruelty born in a moment of pain-filled inspiration that sent a chill down Duncan's spine. A lucky guess, Duncan raised his hands in an approximation of a shrug. He couldn't quite do the real thing anymore, and was careful to make it seem a mark of the insouciant laziness inherent to the dashing, roguish persona he chose to cultivate, rather than exposing the truth, that it was yet another sign of his physical infirmity. After another few moments, he admitted, I had no idea that Ricardo's father had been a soldier. All I knew back then was that I was in pain, and I wanted to hurt him back. So I took a low blow at his family honor. Duncan smiled momentarily, as a memory crossed his mind unbidden. Vetchi never forgave me for that.
Good memories and bad.
The man rose from his partially mangled stool. Duncan didn't, until an inhumanly strong hand on his shoulder lifted him bodily from it.
We should be getting you back to the camp. This place meant something to you?
Duncan ran a weathered hand over the battered bar. It had burned in the invasion, and the far end was crushed under a pile of rubble. Maurice and his family had died when the word of Blake's secret army had seized Solaris. Duncan would be the bar's final patron. No, Duncan said, shaking his head. Nothing at all. I just wanted a drink.
I won't pry,
the Blakist replied. His lips curled into a sly smile that suggested he thought Duncan hadn't been speaking the whole truth. The big man turned towards the door, then paused, hesitating for a moment as he turned back to regard Duncan with glowing red eyes that lacked even the facade of humanity old Jax had possessed.
By the way, Fisher, we're going to be restarting the game soon.
Duncan raised a hand in a placating gesture. I can't fight again, Adept. I thought the blessed Blake didn't believe in gambling.
It's not about money. Not anymore.
The man smiled, his lips parting cruelly to expose teeth that seemed coated with ferro-fibrous armor and sharpened to a deadly point. Duncan didn't flinch from the view, but simply stared in silence while he waited for his companion to elaborate.
It's about showing our troops the moral inferiority of the common man. We are here to bring the peace of Blake to the whole of the inner sphere, the clans, all of it. We can't have our brothers and sisters questioning what they're fighting and dying for. What better way than to show them the cruelty and decadence of the people we're fighting to save? So we'll need fighters to die gloriously for Blake, that's true enough. That's not why we need you. The Master has bigger plans.
The man leaned closer to Duncan and whispered conspiratorially.
We need an announcer. And who better than the man who's been the voice of Solaris itself for the past 15 years?
He held out an open hand, an invitation to seal the deal with a shake.
What say you, Fisher?
Duncan stared at the proffered limb, the same way he might have regarded a venomous snake, and said, I didn't shake hands the last time I agreed to this job. I won't this time either. But I'll do it, goddamn you, even though I'd rather be the one in the pilot's chair.